Today we're going to go over what is online advertising. So what is online advertising? This should be no surprises. Any advertising that you actually consume in a digital media, whether it's on a computer or on a phone or any other device. And there are different forms that online advertising actually takes in the wild, right? Anywhere from ads that you will find in a website, maybe as a banner ad or as a pop-up ad. Could be an ad that actually shows up in an email that you are getting from maybe a company, for example. Ads that are displayed within social networks, which we have already discussed to a large degree, and also ads that you actually see when you're maybe consuming some video online. Like, for example, if you go to a YouTube channel, oftentimes maybe at the beginning or during the video you will get an advertising. So these are all, at least some of the different forms that online advertising takes. So what we're going to do today is go a little bit more in detail about what online advertising is, what kind of forms it takes, and how can we manage it to actually make better use of it. So let's start with the beginning. I hope that you will see a trend by now. For the most part, when it comes down to managing any of these digital assets, you always need to start with the goals that you're trying to achieve. Right? If you don't understand your objectives, it's really hard to pick the right tool to actually achieve those objectives. So to begin with, let's discuss what objectives could you actually have. Now for this, what we're going to do, like we have been doing I think consistently by now, is we're going to follow the customer journey, right? Because this is a marketing class, we're going to be focusing on the customer. And if you understand how the customer goes through the different stages before it actually makes a purchase, the first stage is going to be awareness, right? So for this, what you're going to do is you're going to understand that ads are particularly good when it comes down to awareness. And in fact, most of the advertising that you're going to do online, it's going to be driven by impressions. You're going to be interested in getting the ads in front of people so they actually see that. So when you're looking at an ad campaign, it will be sometimes, although it depends what you're trying to achieve, but it will be sometimes a mistake to just deem a campaign as a failure if the click-through rate of CTR is low for an ad. Because oftentimes the effect that you're trying to get is just awareness. And if all you're trying to do is make people aware of your product or your brand, then click-through rate is probably a metric that you should not emphasize in this stage, right? So in this regard, make sure that later your objective should drive the metrics you use. So oftentimes in advertising, we're interested in impressions, on getting the ad in front of people so they actually see it and recognize it, so that you know who your brand is, maybe what they stand for, and what kind of products you have available, right? Oftentimes you start with awareness, but you might be able to work towards more sophisticated efforts where you're going to go from just knowing your brand, which will be typical brand awareness, to moving to other aspects of your brand essence, like for example, brand imagery or brand associations, right? So once that people know you, now you want to start telling a story, and the advertising can actually help you with that, right? So if there are specific aspects that you're trying to convey as your key differentiating aspects, then maybe here is the point we start building that through maybe some imagery, okay? Now, at a later stages, right, advertising can also help. Advertising can also help convey that unique value that your product or brand actually has, right? And that will not be only in the awareness stage, but maybe work into the consideration or selection stages of your customer journey, right? So there, advertising can help you trying to persuade people as to why your brand or product is uniquely qualified to solve the problem that they are facing, right? So this idea of a unique selling point or a unique value proposition is what you try to convey through the advertising. So there has to be a message. It's not just this is who we are, but this is who we are and this is what we can do for you, right? So you are moving the customer through the different stages. And an ad that might work really well for awareness might not be well suited for this persuasion stage. So obviously you're going to have to create the ad in a way that actually makes sense given the objective. If you're trying to do awareness, maybe the ad should look quite different from if you're trying to persuade them, right? Later in the stage, you may also add a call to action within your ad, right? So you move from, this is the unique value proposition that, you know, we have to, hey, if you want to get the product, click here, right? And so in a situation like that, then is when it will make a lot of sense that you use KPIs or key performance indicators, such as click-through rate or CTR, right? Where you're not just interested in impressions, but you want to make sure that you're moving people along this sales funnel and that you actually move to conversions. So now I want you guys to again understand that when you're looking at metrics, just because somebody clicks on the ad doesn't mean that they are actually going to buy the product, right? So the way you define conversion is going to be very important. And we'll discuss this in more detail when we discuss measuring and tracking at later stages. But be aware that just because they click on the ad doesn't mean that they're actually going to buy the product. So there might be a difference between clicking in the ad, which is going to help you move towards a sale, and the actual sale. So how you set this up and what objectives you have, it's going to be important for you to decide whether it's actually working or not. Now, to this end, and if you're talking about tracking and ad success, one thing that is going to be very important, and I want to touch on, is this idea of attribution, right? So if you see an ad on Monday, right, and then you go and buy the product on Friday, and did the ad work? Well, it really depends on how you measure success. And when it comes down to measurement, the way you track that is this idea of attribution. And there are different ways of providing attribution or providing credit for the action. And by the way, the action doesn't have to be purchased. I'm just using this as an example. It could be something else, right? Any action, any CTA, you can actually do attribution modeling for. So this idea of attribution modeling is, what do you give credit for, right? And there is going to be different ways of doing it. You can give credit only to the first action that actually led to the conversion at a later time, right? So if the person saw 3 different ads, right, only the first advertising is the one that gets credit for it. Or there are other ways of assigning credit, and I'm not going to get into all the technicalities because this is an empirical issue, but be aware of how you define something as successful is going to be to a large degree a function of the metrics that you use and how that credit is attributed. And the difficulty with advertising is that there are going to be a lot of effects that might actually attenuate, but they might be long lasting. So what we give credit to and how we measure it, it's going to impact the return on investment that we measure and whether we feel like advertising is working for us or not. Okay. So what I want to do from here on in this presentation is discuss the different forms that advertising can take online. And there are more than the ones that I'm going to discuss, but I'm going to touch on the biggest options or biggest players online. Because advertising takes many different forms. And we have already discussed a few of them in more detail, like for example, social media. So I will not emphasize those so much, and I will talk about the ones that we haven't discussed yet. So the first type that we tangentially touch upon was this idea of responsive display ads, which this is within the Google Display Network. So this is the Google ecosystem, right? And given that Google is such a huge player in search, we already touched on this a little bit when we discussed search. But the idea here is Google enables you to build ads. And the nice thing about this option or this ecosystem is that Google is well aware that people are consuming content in different platforms, mobile, tablets, and then let's say desktops, and could be also TV. And so because of this, what they do is they have this flexible platform that enables Google to create an ad that is best suited for the interface that the customer is consuming the content on. So what you're going to do is you're going to build these responsive ads by providing Google with enough both content and images or video that will give some flexibility to Google and create an ad that it thinks, using some AI essentially, that it's going to display the best, as in it has the highest likelihood of being clicked in by the customer. And for this, Google is going to use all the horsepower of all the data that it has built by looking at similar usage cases from other people, right? And so what Google is going to ask you to do is going to ask you to provide some images, usually between 2 and 15 high quality images about your product or your brand. Then it's going to ask you for a series of short and long headlines. The reason why it asks you both lengths is so that it can display it in different ways. Like for example, in mobile, you are going to be more likely to use a short headline because there is smaller screen space, and because of that smaller ad, it's going to display better. It's going to be more readable, which is important so that people actually get the message of the ad. Then it's going to ask you for your brand name or business name, your logo, right? You might have different size logos so that it can actually fit the right environment. Video, which is an option, it doesn't have to be there, but videos convey stories well. That video needs to be short, usually under 30 seconds, right? And then if there is a call to action, it's going to give you the option of having a destination URL where you want people to go to. That traditionally will be a series of landing pages, right? And then some sort of description, usually under 90 characters. And then finally, you might have other customized CTAs. It doesn't have to be just a sale. It could be like a sign-in form, for example, and on and on. There are different digital assets that you're going to have as optional, but the core assets are the ones that I was mentioning. And what Google is going to enable you to do is essentially, well, what Google is going to do in the background for you, I should say, is it's going to create these variations on the ads that, according to Google's data and models, are going to be best suited for the environment. So with the same sort of information, it's going to create variants that Google thinks are going to work best. So this is essentially optimizing your digital advertising given their ecosystem that Google actually has. Good. What other options do you have? You have banner ads. These are great graphic and text assets that are displayed either at the top, at the bottom, or typically in the sides of a website. Here you have a series of them, both top and bottom, right? And there are different types of digital assets that it can actually take. It can be very simple. It could be just a static image, or it could be rich media, right? It could be video, it could be some sort of GIF little applet that it does a little animation, right? So there are different formats on this. There are also different sizes, as you would come no surprise. Some are more typical than others, but there is quite a bit of variance. Oftentimes the size is determined by the advertising network that you actually use. So they might actually take some ad sizes, but not others. And obviously you should be well aware of this when you're creating the ad copy to make sure that you don't get your ads rejected. Oftentimes they need to be basically approved by the digital network. So make sure that you know what the requirements are from a technical standpoint. And also the type of file matters, etc. Right? Other than the technical limitations, how do you go about creating this? A lot of common sense here. We've already alluded to most of these tips, but given that they are visual images or maybe video, and they are something that necessarily the customer is not looking for, making them stand out, it's typically important, and that means they need to be very visually appealing. This is something that typically you want to test, and I mean every advertising environment is going to enable you to do, for example, A/B testing to see which images are actually working better than others. right? But it's very important that not only it's visually appealing, but also that whatever message you are trying to convey is clear and concise. And if there is a call to action associated with that, which there usually is, it's very clear and you can just see it and see. So if you want to shop for this, then click here, right? And also be aware, and I think this is true of all the ads that we're going to discuss today, that there are digital filters that users usually install on their machines that block some of this content. So you have ad blockers. And this applies to all the ads that I'm going to be discussing, or most of the ads that I'm going to be discussing today. But they're typically enabled in this and in video ads. Other forms that are maybe less understood from a user perspective, but experienced nonetheless, is this idea of interstitial banners. And these are, instead of partial screen ads like the banner ads that we were discussing, they are typically full screen or almost full screen ads, right? That are usually used in some sort of transition between content. Like typically, this will be used in apps if the app is loading some information. So in between the time that the app is loading and displaying the content that the actual user wants, you might have an ad that is played for you. Now, because of the nature of the ads and because they are in transition and because the person is trying to get something that they want, this can be quite obtrusive and they can annoy customers. Remember, at the end of the day, an annoyed customer is not going to be happy to go to your website and buy your product. So make sure that when you are designing this, you place them in places where the user doesn't actually get as annoyed. So if you tell the user that the information is loading and at the same time you display the ad, they might be less likely to be annoyed, for example. And they can take different forms. It could be static image or it could be graphics and video, etc. In almost all cases, they are interactive, meaning that you typically give the user the possibility of closing the ad, although maybe you have a minimum time that is forced, like for example 3 or 4 seconds, and then there is the possibility of closing. That is very typical, so that the user remains some control over the ad, but there's still an impression. In this case, an impression will be basically determined as the client or the user or the visitor is exposed to the ad for 4 seconds or less, right? And then you might be able also to engage with the ad. So not only you can close the ad, but maybe you can also visit the website or some other call to action associated with the ad. Most of these interstitial banner ads are actually on a mobile platform. The reason why they are used so much more here is because there is a lot less real estate. So having a full screen ad makes more sense in mobile because real estate is at such a premium. So you may be able to see an ad that otherwise in a banner it might be hardly discernible by a user, right? And it's of particular importance in this type of ads that you consider the frequency of the display. What I mean by that is, if you're using these ads all the time, people are gonna get annoyed and they're gonna stop using your app or they're gonna stop going to your website. And the reason why is because you're basically putting such a load and making the usage or usability of the app or the page so low that people are gonna just get annoyed. And remember, at the end of the day, the idea with the ads is basically not to annoy customers because that's gonna have a very deleterious effect in the long term, but to provide an opportunity to basically move them along the journey, right? So you might be better off lowering the frequency of these kind of displays and getting a higher quality conversion as opposed to getting many instances that enable conversion but getting plummeting click-through rates because people have seen so many ads. Another type of ad that used to be very prevalent many years ago, and maybe now it's uh, somewhat disappearing or becoming less common, is pop-ups and pop-unders. This is whenever you load a website, typically, or it could be an app too, and there is another site that basically pops up in front of what you're seeing, typically smaller size screen than the one that you had open, right? So that you will notice that it's not taking the entire screen, but it's taking some of it, right? Or it could just show up under, and that means that until you close your main site, you will not see that pop under, and you will see it at the end of your browsing session, right? Now, because of their nature, because they show up in front of you and they limit the ability that you have to interact with the site that you were interacting with to begin with, they are considered intrusive, like we were talking about the interstitial ads, although they are seen as more intrusive because they kind of take precedence over what you were doing, and you actually have to close them to continue until you can actually do that. Whereas with interstitial banners, you might be able to just wait until they run through and then you can continue. So they seem to be even a little bit more intrusive. They are still somewhat popular in some mobile sites, and mostly with what I will call shady sites, right? So if you're interested into the maybe not the darker side of the internet, but let's just say the grayer areas of the internet, chances are you're going to be exposed to pop-ups, because it tends to be that shady sites are the ones that use this heavily. And yeah, but these are somewhat of a dying breed at this point. And finally, for this presentation, I'm going to talk about a few other formats that you will also run into. Another one is floating ads. This is when you see an overlay over the screen that you were into, and it kind of has a gray screen or filter over what you were doing before, and there is some sort of call to action on it, like click here if you want to go to our screen or to our site, or if you want to buy our product, right? And oftentimes there is some sort of way of closing that overlay. This is in a way kind of a special case of a pop-up, I guess. And again, these tend to be ads that you can interact with, so you might be able to close them. Usually that's one of the features, but you might also be able to click on them. Another type of ad that you're going to see are wallpaper ads. This is when the base wallpaper of the site where you are in changes to kind of give you some information about a product. So here you have an example where you have a wallpaper ad for a movie, right? So you are in this site, maybe reading a blog or a review about a movie, and then there is a different movie that shows up in your background as a potential product that you will be interested in. Again, targeting is going to be usually focused on customers that you think are good prospects. Like in this case, we'll talk more about targeting in the next presentation. But the nice thing about all these digital assets is that you can leverage information that you have about the user, or in this case, what site they are actually seeing at the moment, because you know that, right? And sometimes these pop-up ads are interactive, but not always. So if you click on this, it might take you to the site where you can maybe buy tickets like Fandango, or it might just tell you more, like show you a trailer of the movie. Yeah. Another type of ads, and I don't have a screen, one in the screen here, is map ads. So if you're using Waze, for example, in your phone to get to a place, there might be a pop-up ad for, I don't know, McDonald's, for example. And the reason why you can do this, obviously, is because you're using Waze, so your GPS is active, and now Google knows that you're driving within, let's say, a mile or two of a McDonald's, and it also knows the time of the day, right? And it might also know how long you've been driving, because your Waze app, it's up and running. So when you put all this information together, you can just suggest something that you can do right now. So if it's around noon, you've been driving for 3 hours and you're driving by a McDonald's, that is a perfect opportunity for a little pop-up to show up and tell you, hey, why don't you just visit us at McDonald's? We have, I don't know, a special on Big Macs for $3, right? And then finally, another broad area of advertising is this idea of video ads, right? And this can be displayed in many different formats and many different platforms, but given that the most video consumed online is in YouTube, here you have an example of a YouTube ad, which is usually played either at the beginning or in the middle of a video that you're trying to watch in YouTube. And as you can see over here, typically not only you see the ad, but you have an opportunity, typically, although not always, to skip the ad. So if an ad it's a minute, after 4 or 5 seconds, YouTube will give you the option sometimes to skip it. Other times you are forced to watch the whole ad, but typically video ads that you're forced to watch, at least in YouTube as a platform, they tend to be much shorter than the ones that you have an option to skip. And that's what I have for you for today.